Your translator is lying. Single dad waiter warns the billionaire just in time. What could make a single dad waiter interrupt a billionaire at such a critical moment? And why would a warning like that change everything? Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here for another unforgettable story filled with courage, dignity, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about quiet heroes and life-changing moments, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support means more than you know, and we truly appreciate you being part of this community. Before we begin, tell us in the comments. If you heard someone say, "Your translator is lying," would you speak up or stay silent? Now, settle in, and let's discover how one ordinary moment became the beginning of an extraordinary story. Your translator is lying. Ethan Brooks' voice cut through the crystal ballroom just as Victoria Sterling's fountain pen hovered an inch above the signature line. Every conversation stopped. Crystal glasses chimed softly against polished marble as dozens of executives turned toward the lone waiter standing beside a linen-covered service cart, the rich aroma of freshly brewed Colombian coffee still rising from the silver urn beside him. Security guards immediately stepped forward, their polished shoes clicking sharply across the floor, while the lead interpreter adjusted his silk tie and smiled with practiced confidence. Victoria slowly lowered her pen without signing. The room held its breath. Ethan didn't move. His white dress shirt was neatly pressed despite a 12-hour shift, and the black apron around his waist carried faint traces of roasted espresso and warm bread from the kitchen downstairs. His heartbeat echoed inside his ears, yet his hands remained steady around the coffee pot. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his eyes on Victoria instead of the guards, "please don't sign that contract until someone checks what your interpreter is actually saying." A ripple of disbelief swept through the room. Someone laughed. Another executive whispered that the waiter had finally lost his mind. The interpreter answered, before Victoria could speak. "He's mistaken," he said with a pleasant smile. "He obviously misunderstood a language he doesn't speak." A few board members nodded immediately. That explanation sounded comfortable. Safe. Victoria studied Ethan for only a second before shifting her attention back to the distinguished interpreter she had trusted for nearly 5 years. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly. "None at all," the interpreter replied without hesitation. "The gentleman is confused." Ethan inhaled slowly. The cool air from the ballroom's hidden vents brushed across his face, while the scent of expensive perfume mixed with polished walnut furniture and fresh flowers arranged beneath glittering chandeliers. He knew exactly what he had heard because every syllable spoken by the overseas delegation had landed with perfect clarity. The sentence translated into English moments earlier wasn't merely inaccurate. It had been completely reversed. Across the long mahogany conference table, the foreign executives exchanged brief glances. One elderly delegate subtly frowned before hiding the expression behind a courteous smile. Ethan noticed it. Victoria noticed nothing. She was already reaching for the contract again. "Sir," one security officer said quietly as he approached Ethan, "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the meeting." Ethan nodded politely but didn't retreat. "I will," he answered, "after she hears one more sentence." The officer extended a hand toward his arm. Before it could touch him, Ethan looked directly at Victoria once more. "Ask him," Ethan said, his voice calm enough to silence the nearest conversations, "to repeat exactly what your partners just said without changing a single word." The interpreter chuckled softly. "This is becoming ridiculous." But before anyone could dismiss Ethan completely, one member of the foreign delegation slowly stood from his chair, adjusted his glasses, and spoke a single sentence in his native language. Ethan answered immediately, without hesitation, his pronunciation flawless enough that the executive's eyes widened while the interpreter's smile disappeared for the very first time. The elderly executive held Ethan's gaze for several long seconds before slowly nodding. The faint hum of the ballroom's air conditioning seemed louder now, mixing with the quiet clink of crystal glasses as every person around the conference table waited for someone else to speak first. Victoria rose from her leather chair instead. The polished wood reflected the chandelier light beneath her fingertips as she gently closed the contract without signing it. "No one leaves," she said, her voice even. "We're going to settle this right now." The security officers immediately stopped escorting Ethan away. Instead, they stepped back toward the walls, watching both men equally. The interpreter gave a polite laugh that sounded thinner than before. Ms. Sterling, with respect, we're wasting valuable time. Our partners have another meeting in 40 minutes. Victoria looked toward the overseas delegation. Do you? The elderly executive answered in his own language. Ethan translated without waiting. He says they will stay as long as necessary because accuracy matters more than schedules. A younger delegate immediately nodded in agreement. The interpreter quickly interrupted. That's not what he said. Ethan calmly lifted one hand. Then ask him yourself. Victoria walked around the conference table, her heels striking the marble floor in slow, deliberate rhythm. She stopped beside the elderly executive and picked up the wireless translation headset resting beside his folder. Would you be willing to repeat your last statement? She asked. The executive smiled politely and spoke again, carefully, one sentence at a time. Ethan translated after each sentence without raising his voice. The interpreter waited until he finished before offering a completely different version. The room grew still. One board member frowned and quietly compared both translations on his tablet. Another glanced toward the foreign delegation, whose puzzled expressions no longer matched the interpreter's polished confidence. Victoria folded her arms. Again, she said. This time she pointed to a younger delegate. Another sentence. Another pair of translations. Once more, they did not match. The warm scent of fresh coffee, drifting from Ethan's forgotten service card, mixed with the faint smell of leather portfolios as tension settled over the room like invisible weight. The interpreter loosened his tie. Languages are nuanced, he explained. Professional translation often requires interpretation. Ethan shook his head gently. Not when someone clearly says they reject a clause and you translate that they accept it. A quiet murmur swept across the executives. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She pulled the thick contract toward herself and flipped through the pages until her fingers stopped on a highlighted section. Which clause? Ethan stepped forward only after she nodded for him to approach. Remaining beside the table rather than sitting, he pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of page 23. That one. Victoria read silently. One of her attorneys leaned closer, the crisp paper rustling beneath his hand. If this translation is wrong, the attorney said carefully, this clause transfers exclusive licensing rights after 90 days. No one spoke. The interpreter finally looked directly at Ethan. His practiced smile disappeared completely. You should be very careful with accusations, he said. Ethan met his eyes without blinking. Then let's stop arguing. He turned toward Victoria. Bring in an independent certified translator right now. If I'm wrong, I'll hand in my apron and walk out forever. If I'm right, don't let him say another word on your behalf. No one reached for the contract. Instead, Victoria pressed a single button on the sleek conference phone built into the center of the mahogany table. A soft electronic chime echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. Get me the nearest federally certified interpreter, she said. Tell them I need them here immediately. The assistant's voice answered through the speaker. The closest available specialist is finishing an arbitration hearing 4 blocks away. Earliest arrival, 25 minutes. Victoria glanced toward the wall clock. The polished silver hands ticked steadily toward the hour when the international banking window would close. The lead interpreter leaned forward, resting both palms on the smooth tabletop. Miss Sterling, delaying this signing could cost your company millions in market movement before closing. His voice remained calm, but a faint sheen of perspiration had begun to appear beneath the collar of his expensive navy suit. Ethan quietly wheeled the untouched coffee cart a few feet away from the table so no one would need to step around it. The scent of dark roast coffee drifted through the room as porcelain cups rattled softly against silver trays. He did not speak again until Victoria looked at him directly. 25 minutes, she said. Can this wait? Ethan answered without hesitation. If the agreement is honest, 25 minutes changes nothing. If it isn't, 25 minutes could save everything. The foreign delegation exchanged brief words among themselves. This time, Victoria watched their faces instead of listening to the interpreter. An elderly delegate raised one finger, then gently tapped the unsigned contract twice before folding his hands together. The interpreter smiled again. He says they are disappointed by the delay. Ethan looked at the same delegate and calmly replied in the man's language. The executive immediately smiled, and answered with a small bow of his head. Ethan turned back toward Victoria. He actually said they appreciate your commitment to accuracy because trust lasts longer than speed. Silence settled over the room. Even the faint buzz of recessed lighting above the walnut ceiling seemed unusually sharp. Victoria slowly shifted her attention from Ethan to the delegate. "Is that correct?" she asked. The elderly man answered in English this time, his accent heavy but unmistakable. "Yes, correct." Several executives around the table exchanged uneasy looks. The interpreter opened his mouth, but found no words before quietly closing it again. One attorney removed his glasses, wiped the lenses with a folded cloth, and carefully slid the contract farther away from the signing position. Victoria took a deep breath and reached for her phone. Without looking away from the interpreter, she opened her company's secure legal portal and pressed the red button marked Contract Suspension. A soft confirmation tone sounded. Through the speaker, the digital signature session immediately expired. Every electronic copy of the agreement on the conference room monitors switched from green to gray. The interpreter stared at the screens as the color drained from his face. Victoria stood beside the table, folded the contract shut with deliberate care, and spoke in a voice so steady that no one interrupted. "This deal will not move forward another single inch until an independent interpreter confirms every word that has been spoken today." The conference room doors opened with a muted click exactly 23 minutes later, and every eye shifted toward the woman carrying a slim leather portfolio beneath the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. The independent interpreter introduced herself with quiet professionalism before placing her state certification beside Victoria's tablet. Fresh ink and polished leather mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee as she adjusted her glasses and took the empty chair between the foreign delegation and the executive board. Victoria slid the unsigned contract toward the center of the table. "We're starting from the beginning," she said. "No summaries. Every word." The interpreter nodded once. The elderly delegate spoke first, his voice measured and steady. She translated each sentence with careful precision, her tone matching his exactly. Ethan remained beside the service cart without interrupting, listening with folded hands. The original interpreter stood near the projection screen, his jaw tight, watching every exchange. As the meeting continued, small differences began appearing one after another. A phrase previously translated as exclusive authority became shared authority. A statement presented earlier as final approval was actually subject to mutual review. The soft tapping of keyboards filled the room as company attorneys revised their notes line by line. Victoria circled several passages with a silver pen, the scratching sound sharp against the silence. She never looked away from the documents. Every correction erased another assumption she had accepted only minutes earlier. The foreign executives gradually relaxed. One accepted a cup of coffee from Ethan with a grateful nod, then continued speaking through the certified interpreter without hesitation. The room no longer felt divided. It felt focused. The original interpreter finally stepped forward. "These are stylistic choices," he insisted. "Business negotiations require flexibility." The certified interpreter slowly closed her notebook. "Not when legal obligations are involved," she replied. "Accuracy is not a style. It is a requirement." The words settled heavily across the polished table. Victoria reached for another section of the agreement and asked the delegation to explain the purpose of a licensing provision that had caused repeated disagreement. The answer came calmly through the certified interpreter. Every executive on Victoria's side immediately exchanged startled glances because the clause had never granted permanent control to either company. It simply established a temporary review period before either side could proceed. The entire conflict had been created by the previous translation. Ethan quietly rolled the coffee cart away from the center aisle, giving everyone an unobstructed view of the contract spread across the table. He did not say a word. He no longer needed to. The evidence now spoke louder than he ever could. Victoria stood, removed the marked-up contract from its binder, and placed the corrected pages beside the originals. The thick paper brushed softly beneath her fingertips. Then she faced the original interpreter directly. "You've represented my company for 5 years," she said. "So before I make my next decision, I'm giving you exactly one opportunity." The room became perfectly still. "Explain every discrepancy yourself, right now, or accept that someone else will explain them for you." The interpreter drew a slow breath and straightened his jacket before answering, the polished cuff links catching the warm chandelier light as complete silence settled over the conference room. Every experienced interpreter knows literal translation can damage negotiations, he said evenly. I chose language that encouraged cooperation instead of conflict. Victoria remained standing, one hand resting on the unopened contract while the certified interpreter quietly folded her notes. Encouraged cooperation? Victoria repeated. Or changed legal meaning? The interpreter spread his hands with practiced confidence. There is no meaningful difference. Ethan finally stepped away from the coffee cart. The rubber wheels stopped with a soft squeak against the marble floor as the scent of roasted coffee drifted between the executives. He picked up one document from the corrected stack only after Victoria nodded. May I? She answered with a single gesture. Ethan looked toward the elderly delegate. Would you mind repeating the sentence regarding intellectual property exactly as you originally stated it? The delegate agreed immediately. His calm voice echoed across the room while every attorney lowered their eyes to the printed contract. Ethan translated each phrase one sentence at a time, never adding a word, never removing one. The certified interpreter quietly confirmed every line. Then the original interpreter stepped forward and delivered his own version. This time the difference could not be explained away. Ethan's translation preserved shared ownership. The interpreter's version transferred exclusive operational control. One board member slowly pushed back from the table, his leather chair gliding across the floor with a long scrape. Another executive removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully beside his notebook without saying a word. Victoria looked directly at her chief legal officer. Would our signed version have reflected his translation? The attorney swallowed once before answering. Yes. Every legal obligation would have followed the English version we approved. The room became perfectly still again. The certified interpreter closed the final folder with a quiet snap. That is not interpretation, she said. That is alteration. The original interpreter's expression hardened. You're making me the scapegoat because a waiter embarrassed everyone. He turned sharply toward Ethan. Who are you to challenge someone with 20 years of international negotiation experience? Ethan met his stare without raising his voice. Someone who listened before speaking. The answer hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Victoria walked around the table until she stood beside Ethan instead of across from him. The move was small, almost effortless, yet every executive noticed it immediately. The balance inside the room shifted. She no longer faced the waiter as a disruption. She stood beside him as the only person whose warning had protected the meeting before any document was signed. The interpreter noticed it too. His shoulders stiffened. He reached into his briefcase, removed his company identification badge, and placed it carefully on the polished table. The plastic card slid several inches before stopping beside the unsigned contract. If my professional judgment is no longer trusted, he said quietly, then I have nothing else to say. Victoria never touched the badge. She looked instead toward the conference room doors where security had been waiting since Ethan first spoke. Please escort him to the executive office, she said. He'll remain there until every document, every recording, and every translation from today's meeting has been reviewed before we decide what happens next. The conference room doors closed with a quiet thud behind security, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, no one looked toward the exit. Every gaze settled on Ethan instead. The polished marble reflected the warm chandelier light beneath his worn black shoes, while the faint aroma of coffee still drifted from the untouched service cart beside him. Victoria slowly returned to her chair, but did not sit. She gathered the corrected documents into a single stack and slid them toward the certified interpreter. Let's finish this the right way, she said. The foreign delegation nodded almost in unison. One by one, they reopened their leather portfolios, the soft rustle of paper replacing the earlier tension. The certified interpreter resumed, translating every sentence with deliberate precision. Ethan stepped back, giving the professionals room to work, yet he remained close enough to hear each exchange. Several minutes passed without interruption. Every clause now matched on both sides of the table. Every question received the same answer in both languages. The atmosphere changed completely. Conversations became measured instead of guarded. Pens tapped gently against notebooks. Steam no longer rose from the coffee because it had grown cold, but no one noticed. They were finally negotiating instead of defending themselves. Victoria paused before the final review and looked toward Ethan again. "Come here for a moment." He hesitated before walking to the table, carefully removing his serving gloves and placing them beside the silver tray. The fabric landed softly against the polished wood. "When did you realize the translation was wrong?" she asked. Ethan answered simply, "The first time your partners discussed ownership." "How?" Victoria asked. "Most people in this room never noticed." Ethan glanced toward the foreign delegates before replying. "Because words have weight." They weren't speaking like people giving something away. They were speaking like people trying to build something together. The elderly delegate smiled warmly after hearing the certified translation of Ethan's answer. He slowly stood, walked around the conference table, and extended his hand. Ethan accepted it with quiet respect. The executive spoke briefly in his native language. The certified interpreter translated. "He says thank you for protecting both companies, not just one." A low murmur spread around the room. Several board members who had dismissed Ethan only an hour earlier now watched him with entirely different expressions. Victoria reached into her folder and removed the unsigned contract. She tore away the earlier English draft that contained the incorrect language, folded it once, and placed it into the confidential disposal envelope beside her chair. The crisp paper crackled sharply in the otherwise silent room. Then she positioned the newly verified version on the table. "This," she said, "is the only agreement that will ever carry my signature." She uncapped her fountain pen again, but before lowering it to the page, she looked directly at Ethan. "You stopped me from making the biggest mistake of my career." Ethan gave a small nod. "I only asked you to wait." Victoria smiled faintly, then signed the corrected agreement. One after another, the foreign executives added their signatures as well. The sound of each pen touching paper echoed like a series of quiet promises finally made honestly. When the last signature was complete, the elderly delegate remained standing, looked at Ethan with unmistakable recognition, and asked through the certified interpreter, "May I ask one question? A man who understands language the way you do, why is he serving coffee instead of leading negotiations?" The question lingered in the quiet room as the last signature dried beneath the warm chandelier light. Ethan looked down at the white serving gloves resting beside the silver coffee tray, then gently picked them up, folding each finger with careful precision before answering. "Because a steady job feeds my daughter every week," he said. "Titles don't." No one laughed. The soft hum of the air vents and the faint clink of cooling coffee cups filled the silence instead. Victoria studied him for a long moment before extending her hand. "Ethan," she said, "walk with me." Together they crossed the marble floor toward the panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline, where the late afternoon sun reflected in sheets of gold across the surrounding glass towers. The foreign delegation remained seated, quietly speaking among themselves through the certified interpreter while attorneys organized the newly signed documents into secure folders. Victoria stopped beside the window. "You saved a deal worth billions today," she said. "You could have stayed silent, served coffee, finished your shift, and gone home. Why didn't you?" Ethan rested the folded gloves on the window ledge. Beyond the glass, traffic flowed steadily 20 stories below, tiny headlights beginning to appear as daylight softened. "Because once you know the truth," he replied, "silence becomes another kind of lie." Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before turning back toward the conference table. Without raising her voice, she addressed the executive board. "Effective immediately, every international negotiation will require dual language verification from independent professionals. No contract leaves. This company on trust alone again." Pens immediately began moving. One executive opened a laptop. Another attorney rewrote the company's compliance checklist before the meeting had even officially ended. Ethan watched quietly as a single decision transformed the way the corporation would operate long after this day was over. The elderly delegate approached once more carrying a polished wooden presentation box. He opened it slowly, revealing a handcrafted fountain pen engraved with both companies' names. Through the certified interpreter, he smiled and said, "Our tradition is to present this only to those who protect partnership with honesty." He offered it to Victoria first. She accepted it respectfully, then closed the box and turned toward Ethan. "This belongs to the person who made today's partnership possible." Ethan hesitated, then gently pushed the box back toward her. It belongs with the agreement you signed, he said. I already have everything I came here to earn today. The elderly delegate nodded with visible respect. Several executives quietly applauded. The sound was restrained, genuine, and brief. Victoria walked back to the head of the conference table and picked up Ethan's folded serving gloves herself. She held them for a second before looking directly into his eyes. You're scheduled to finish your shift in the dining room, aren't you? Ethan gave a small nod. In about 10 minutes. Victoria smiled faintly, placed the gloves back into his hands, and spoke with calm certainty. No, you're done serving tables today. Every face around the room turned toward her as she continued. Starting now, I'd like you to come upstairs with me. There's someone on my executive team who needs to hear exactly what you heard, exactly the way you heard it, before I make the next decision that could change both of our futures. Victoria led Ethan through the quiet executive corridor where thick wool carpet softened every footstep and floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the last amber light of the evening across polished steel and glass. The conference room faded behind them while assistants silently carried away folders containing the newly signed agreement. The scent of cedar from the paneled walls mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a nearby reception desk. Ethan still carried his neatly folded serving gloves. Victoria opened the door to the executive strategy room with her security badge and motioned him inside. Several senior executives rose from their seats the moment she entered. A large display on the wall still showed the revised agreement that had just been completed. Victoria walked directly to the head of the table and placed the original interpreter's company badge beside the signed contract. No one touched either object. Today's negotiation is complete, she said. Now we're discussing accountability. The room became perfectly silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. She turned toward Ethan. Tell them exactly what happened from the moment you first heard the conversation. Ethan remained standing rather than taking the empty chair offered to him. He spoke calmly, repeating only what he had personally heard, the exact words that had been translated incorrectly, and the reason he decided to interrupt before the signature was placed on the page. He added nothing dramatic. He exaggerated nothing. Every sentence matched the certified interpreter's written record. One executive slowly removed a headset connected to the meeting archive and replayed the original audio. The foreign delegates' voices filled the room, followed by the disputed translation. Then the certified version played immediately afterward. The difference was unmistakable. One legal advisor quietly closed his notebook and slid it aside. Another executive leaned back without speaking, staring at the frozen contract displayed across the monitor. Victoria crossed her arms. Can anyone in this room still argue that the warning should have been ignored? No one answered. The silence itself became the answer. She pressed another button on the conference table, connecting the security office by video. The former interpreter appeared on the screen, seated alone in a monitored conference room. Victoria looked directly into the camera. We've completed our independent review. The interpreter opened his mouth to defend himself, but Victoria raised one hand, and he stopped speaking. Your translations changed legal obligations. Whether that happened intentionally or through unacceptable professional judgment will be determined by the formal investigation. Until then, every credential granting you authority to represent this company is revoked, effective immediately. A security supervisor standing beside him collected his access badge, company laptop, and identification folder one item at a time, placing each into a sealed evidence envelope. The zipper closed with a crisp metallic sound that echoed through the speakers. No one in the executive room celebrated. Ethan quietly lowered his eyes while Victoria disconnected the call. She picked up the signed agreement, placed it into a secured document case, then turned back toward him. Because you spoke when everyone else remained silent, she said. This partnership exists today exactly as both sides intended. She walked around the table until she stood only a few feet away. Warm light reflected across the polished wood between them. Tomorrow morning, she said with quiet certainty, I'd like you to meet me here again before your shift begins. I have a position to offer, and before I make it official, there's one question I need to ask you face to face. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight spilled across the glass walls of Sterling Global Headquarters, painting long bands of gold across the marble lobby where Ethan Brooks arrived wearing the same neatly pressed white shirt and black apron he had worn the day before. The familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted from the hotel cafe, and the quiet hum of elevators echoed through the atrium. Before he could report for his shift, Victoria Sterling stepped out of a waiting elevator carrying a slim leather folder instead of a briefcase. She smiled, not as a billionaire greeting an employee, but as someone greeting the person who had protected something priceless. Without ceremony, she led him back into the executive conference room, where the signed agreement rested inside a glass display case awaiting shipment to the legal archives. Morning light reflected from the polished table while the corrected contract lay open beside the original pages marked with red revisions. Victoria placed the folder in front of Ethan. Inside was a formal offer to become Director of International Language Integrity, responsible for reviewing every multilingual negotiation conducted by her company. Ethan looked at the title, then quietly closed the folder without signing it. "I'd like to keep serving people," he said with a gentle smile. "Just in a different way." Victoria nodded, understanding immediately. "Then help us build a system that protects truth instead of titles. You won't be hired because you know languages. You'll be hired because you refuse to let power silence honesty." Ethan finally accepted the folder. Around the room, members of the executive board rose from their seats one after another. No applause, no speeches, only respectful handshakes offered in complete silence. Even the foreign delegation, preparing to leave for the airport, returned briefly to thank him in person through the certified interpreter whose careful words now carried exactly the meaning they were meant to. The elderly delegate handed Ethan a simple fountain pen identical to the one offered the previous afternoon. This time Ethan accepted it with both hands. "This belongs to every honest conversation that comes after today," the delegate said through the interpreter. Victoria escorted the delegation to the elevators before returning to the conference room. She stopped beside the window overlooking the city where traffic flowed beneath the bright morning sky. "Yesterday, I almost signed away years of work because I trusted the wrong voice," she said quietly. Ethan stood beside her, the warm ceramic coffee mug in his hand sending gentle steam into the cool air. "You didn't," he replied. "You chose to listen before it was too late." Victoria looked toward the conference table where the corrected agreement rested exactly as both sides had intended from the beginning. The room that had once echoed with doubt now held only calm. Ethan folded his old serving apron carefully across his arm before walking toward his new office, while Victoria watched him go with quiet gratitude instead of relief. The contract had been saved, the partnership had been preserved, and the warning everyone almost ignored had become the reason truth was written into every page that followed, proving that the most valuable translation in the room was never the one spoken the loudest, but the one honest enough to protect another person's future.